Joining me now is the Communications Minister Paul Fletcher. Minister, thanks very much for your time. You've heard the support there from Labor, support from media companies. Give our viewers a sense of the timeline now. How soon will we see the tech giants pay for the news that they use?
Well, what we've said is that we want the ACCC to develop a draft of this mandatory code and have that done by the end of July. That'll then be put into the public domain for comment before a final version is settled. And from that point, that will then have the force of law. If there's a need to legislate to support it, we will. And as a consequence, once those arrangements are in place, then it'll be a requirement for industry participants to comply with the terms of the code. Now, I make the point, it's for the ACCC to determine exactly what those terms are, how it's going to work. The ACCC has advised that the voluntary code that it was developing was not looking likely to come to a resolution on the particularly critical matter of how it is that the content that is developed by Australian media businesses and is used by the digital platforms, how that is paid for, how value is arrived at. There's a number of different ways in doing that, as was mentioned in that package, but that's the ACCC's job, to develop that mandatory code. The draft to be done by end of July, and then it'll be out for public comment.
Do you think that the tech giants thought you were bluffing? Because as Eliza mentioned in that report, they were dragging the chain. The ACCC's told you as much.
Well, it's important to be clear that when the ACCC's Digital Platforms Inquiry final report was issued last year, the government considered that very carefully, and in our response, which we issued in December last year, we said that we would ask the ACCC to develop a voluntary code. We set out a timeline for doing that, but we also said that if that did not produce a satisfactory result, then we reserved the right to take more direct action, including a mandatory code. Now, what's happened over the last few weeks is that we've sought a progress update from the ACCC. Meetings have been held, discussions have been ongoing, but the ACCC's advice was that nothing particularly tangible had been secured at this stage, and in particular, as I mentioned, very key advice that they did not think this voluntary code was going to lead to binding provisions in terms of the value that is received by the digital platforms and how they pay Australian media businesses for that. That's really a very central requirement. It's not the only requirement. There's a number of other issues as well. For example, the Australian media businesses have pointed out that to them it's important to know in advance if there are going to be major changes to the algorithms used by Google and Facebook, because in the past when that's happened, it has caused traffic to drop sharply. Another important factor is the algorithms, it is argued, ought to give a higher priority to original content rather than to articles which are effectively just a cut and paste, a rip and read of work done by other media outlets. So there's a number of factors that the Australian media businesses have highlighted, but one of their key points is it's been virtually impossible for them to sit down and have a commercial negotiation with Facebook and Google. Now, Facebook and Google provide a useful service, but if there's content that's being used that has cost money to produce, then there ought to be payment for it.
Yeah, absolutely. They should pay for it. They've built their businesses on a model of using others' content without paying for it. Now, are you confident that these tech titans will pay for the content, or do you see a scenario where they simply drop the content altogether?
Well, look, let's be clear. This is going to be a significant tussle. The digital platforms are giant global businesses, extremely profitable, and so we are conscious that this is going to require focus and determination. Now, the ACCC has advised us that it believes that a mandatory code can work. Of course, it'll be backed up by the force of law, and Australia is well used to having codes dealing with competition issues. For example, we've got the groceries code, which deals with the power of the supermarket giants and then their negotiations with a whole range of smaller suppliers. So these are not novel issues. Or the ACCC, for example, regulates and has quite direct involvement in commercial negotiations on price in industries like telecommunications. Well, I've certainly personally had experience of that, or energy, or a range of other sectors. So this is very much territory that the ACCC has extensive experience in. I would make this point as well. Over the last 5, 10, 15 years, there's been a range of areas where global media platforms, global digital businesses operating in Australia were not subject to regulation. And in a range of those areas, we have said as a government, this should be regulated. And the message has always come back, oh no, that's inappropriate, that's not how it's done in the rest of the world, Australia will fall behind the rest of the world. But when those laws are put in place by our democratically elected parliament, those businesses have complied. I think about laws I was involved in establishing to deal with the online safety of children, as just one example, and there's many others. So we will go through a thorough, careful process. The ACCC will lead the work in developing this code. Of course, all of the stakeholders will be given a chance to comment, but when we get through that process and give it the force of law, laws put into place by Australia's democratically elected parliament, then the expectation will be, if you're doing business in Australia, then you need to comply with the laws of the land.
Absolutely. No arguments there from us. Of course, there is a vested interest as a member of the news media in this country that we want to have our content paid for. Another vested interest I want to ask you about before you go, and that is as a member of the Foxtel family, Sky News. We broadcast on the Foxtel platform. I'm wondering whether subscription TV is going to get any additional support like free-to-air did last week in terms of the wavering of the tax, the spectrum tax that free-to-air's received.
Well, let's be clear that subscription television does not pay a spectrum tax because you don't use the radio frequency spectrum to distribute your signal. But what you do pay, what subscription TV is required to do, is spend a specified amount of money on Australian drama. And that's been in the law for a long time. Now, Foxtel has put the view to government, along with many other media organisations, that it is very seriously affected by the sharp advertising downturn, which is occurring as a result of COVID-19, and in Foxtel's case, and other media businesses as well, a loss of key content like sports content, which is a major subscription driver. Now, one of the specific things that Foxtel has asked for is relief in relation to its drama obligations. It makes the point those can't be met at the moment because productions are simply not being made. And the government has provided 1 year's worth of emergency relief to Foxtel on that front. And so certainly as Foxtel has come forward to highlight issues where we are able to respond, we have responded. The government certainly understands Foxtel is an important part of the media landscape, very important part of the media landscape. And of course, we also acknowledge that it is facing very significant commercial challenges at the moment as a result of the advertising downturn due to COVID-19 and the impact on subscriptions.
Paul Fletcher, I appreciate your time, Communications Minister. Thanks for that.